to the Philosophy of Medicine Colloquium. We'll get right to it. Can you pass the next? So today we have Dr. Abdi Sanati, who's a clinical inpatient psychiatrist in London, and also a philosophy PhD candidate at the University of Warwick. So he's both a medic and a philosopher. And he's also an alumnus of philosophy of mental disorder master's program in the philosophy department here. So, multi-talented speaker for us today. I think I'll just, one announcement for now. There's a Sanati going around. If you want to give us your email, then we'll have it. We're not sending out regular announcements of events and reminders, although we could start doing that if we want to. But, for example, if there's a cancellation of an event, you'll get an email saying that. So if you want to put your email down. Maybe I'll just let you get to it.
Thank you very much. As Shura said, I'm primarily a clinician, but I've never been referred to as multi-talented, but thank you for that. I just, out of interest, how many of you are philosophy students? So we have a few philosophers, and any of you in field of medicine? So, but the rest, that's interesting to have a mix. So this talk is about defining delusions. And before I start, I just give a couple of cases, so you know that in real life, in practical life, when we work with patients, the difficulty that we face. One case is just a lady who, I have to change some details, that was admitted because she was so preoccupied with some prosthetic thing that some doctors put in her body. And to the extent that believed that it was wrong and it's causing damage to her, but she herself claimed that she had been to a number of doctors, the list was as long as her arm to quote, and they all said there was nothing wrong. And she was in the process of selling her house and going abroad to get it extracted. And the family was distressed and all this, and she ended up in the ward I was working. So after lots of communication with her, we agreed to, at the end, discharge her on a very small dose of antipsychotic, just negotiating. There are times that you should not be very heavy-handed. But later I found out that there was something wrong with the prosthesis, and she was rewarded a few hundreds of thousands of pounds compensation from those doctors who said that there was nothing wrong. But interestingly, everybody that came to assess her in mental health believed that she was delusional. So there are times that it's very difficult to say whether an idea is delusion or not. And that is the point of this talk, anyway. So I start with a quote by Carl Jaspers, who is, in a way, the father of modern psychopathology in psychiatry, and a couple of years ago was the centenary of his book, that he wrote that since time immemorial, delusion has been taken as a basic characteristic of madness. To be mad was to be deluded. But he continued that said, it's also one of the basic problems of psychopathology, how to define it. Usually when people write these quotes, they finish at the end of to be mad was to be deluded. But he goes on and said that it is very difficult to define these delusions and find whether there are any necessary or sufficient conditions for them. Here I review some of the definitions, some of the criticisms, get some alternative views, and come back to Jaspers. Here I do not discuss the theories of delusion formation. That's a whole different topic. And it's very interesting too, but that is not the main focus here. This is one of the books that I used to read as a trainee by a British psychiatrist called Frank Fish, who was, again, he was a real multi-talented and multilingual and has read a lot of literature in different languages. And he defined it as a false, unshakable belief which out of keeping with the patient's social and cultural background. This is a quite straightforward and kind of practical definition, but there are some words that you can actually contest. False, unshakable, and a belief. And he said it's a product of internal movement processes. That is what makes it amenable to external influences. But he also agreed that being false is not an essential quality. There is one textbook that all psychiatrists in Britain at least have to read, and that is the short Oxford textbook of psychiatry. And it's longer definition. Again, they say it's a belief, it's firmly held on inadequate grounds, not affected by rational argument and evidence to the contrary, not a conventional belief. And although they didn't put that as a definition, there is this kind of consequentialist angle to it, that they have marked effect on patients' feelings and action. DSM-4, this is the definition that has been quoted most in literature of delusions in the last 20 years. It's a very long definition. Actually, it takes a few minutes to read it. There's many different elements. It's personal belief based on incorrect inference about external reality. I'm not going to read the whole of it. See, there are many different elements is in it. And I have to say, many philosophers and psychiatrists really dissected this definition. They really attacked this definition and different elements of it, like being false, being personal, based on incorrect inferences, and so on. So 20 years later, when they had the DSM-5, they shortened it, and while before it was false belief, here it becomes fixed belief. Again, just not amenable to change in light of conflicting evidence, and they discuss the content. And they have a comment on bizarreness of delusions. That it's implausible, not understandable by cultural peers. And they want to make a distinction between delusion and strongly held ideas, and say it's very difficult to make at times. There have been criticisms of the concept of these definitions. First, the falsity criterion. They say it's not applicable to religious delusions because we cannot empirically test those claims to say whether they're true or false. And there are people who come up with religious delusions. You cannot say whether that criteria doesn't apply. And the example of cuckolded husband is what given by Jaspers, that they have people who delusionally believe that their wives were unfaithful to them, and it turns out they were true. But the way that they arrived at that judgment was very delusional. For instance, something that an example that is given a lot in literature is that the person had seen the lights change from green to red in the traffic lights. And then they realize that, that's evidence that my wife is unfaithful. You can see the process. You cannot jump from seeing the lights change at a certain time and arriving at this conclusion. But again, falsity doesn't apply. And there's some things about external reality. There's some things like thought withdrawal, or that the person believes that some agent is taking the thoughts out of their head. It's about the personal experience, not external reality. And what is personal is not specified. If you go back to the definition, it's a false personal belief. So it's not specific, and there's this very interesting article by Manfred Spitzer, who stated that it's not right, and used the Crockley Taylor's phrase idiosyncratic. Again, delusions can be challenged, and they're not always firmly sustained. They have been challenged, at least they claim to be challenged successfully in CBT. I have to say that there has been some new development, and CBT is not as effective as we thought it was. But still, it is quoted. The inclusion of culture and subculture is seen to exclude some cultural beliefs that seem bizarre or delusional to the outsider. And on the other hand, some people claim that by saying that, you say delusion is something that is culturally determined. A person who's delusional in one culture might be non delusional in another culture. So, say that some challenge this form of cultural relativism. Another thing is the double bookkeeping paradox. We said that people act on their delusions, that patients treat delusions with certain distance only. This is by Louis Sands, an eminent psychologist and philosopher in USA. And they say patients who claim doctors are trying to poison her may happily consume their food. And patients who believe people around him are robots interacts with them. Although it's not always the same. There's an example, someone reported a case, a patient with Capgras delusion, the delusion that they believe someone that's very close to them is replaced by an imposter. That person believed the father was an imposter and a robot, and killed their father and cut their brain open to find the batteries in the head. So they sometimes act on their delusions and with very tragic consequences. Eugene Bloiler, who actually coined the term schizophrenia, said that none of our generals has ever attempted to act in accordance with his imaginary rank and station. Although there is something that came to my mind is that Bloiler probably hadn't seen a general in captivity. Because if you see generals in captivity usually are quite subdued. You never know. And in these old asylums, they were very regimented and the superintendents were very dominant. So you never know. And there has been criticism towards the criterion of doxastic isolation, meaning that the person is the only person who had this belief. And the cases like Andros Breivik show the practical implications of this. Do you know who Andros Breivik was or is?
No.
Anybody not knowing? Remember a few years ago in Norway, there was this guy who killed 77 people. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
It was really, has anyone not heard of him? No, he killed about 77 people. He went over the school people in the island and went and killed 70 of them and planted a bomb near one of the government buildings and killed a lot more. And there was a big debate that whether this guy is psychotic or not. And some people said that his beliefs are very isolated, they're not shared by other white supremacists, so he must be psychotic. Another group said no. And at the end, the verdict was that no, the guy wasn't psychotic. It was a very complex case, and actually some people from Britain had to go and contribute. They tried both statistical and normative accounts, but they were all problematic. But one of the main criticisms is that are delusions beliefs? But the thing is, if you look at all these definitions, they all say there's a belief. Right? Remember when I was a trainee, all these books that we read, they just came out that delusions are beliefs. But then certain people came and said, why do we say that? Let's question, are they really beliefs? The first person who did that was Professor Hermann Berius, who is a very eminent psychiatrist and philosopher and a big historian of psychiatry. He did an analysis mainly on the history of concept, and he said they're mostly speech acts, and although they are considered beliefs which are wrong, but he sees delusions as theoretical constructs that can be changed or replaced. And he believes that we have reached an impasse in study of delusions, and when you study them, there is a great heterogeneity. And he said mainly the criterion in practice that we apply are kind of unshakable. There's mainly bizarreness of content. The unshakability, imperviousness are not very much applied. Although he doesn't base this assertion on kind of something empirical, but it's observation. There was this criteria used by Price, and various use this criteria. So that would say something as a belief, the person must consider alternatives, to consider facts that support the belief and the alternatives, and then chooses one belief over alternatives. And said the delusional person does not do that. And he again goes to say that normal subjects believe within probability constraints. He calls it reality coefficient. And evidence is always assessed in terms of reasonable doubts. And clinical observations show that this probabilistic attitude may be impaired in psychotic subjects. And he believed that they were not like normal beliefs. Structurally, they're different. And so why should we call them beliefs? And his conclusion is that they're empty pitchhanks disguised as beliefs. They contain little information about the world, in spite of the often bombastic claims. And they have some content. So when the delusion is formed, whatever the person is thinking is crystallized in delusion. It's just accidental. And his focus is mainly on pre-delusional state, kind of pre-psychotic state. But it was very influential, his paper, and it's quoted a lot. Another one is by Curry, who said that it's the incapacity of attitude identification. Used on the theory of meta-representations, and delusions are meta-beliefs, and they're caused by failure to identify the imagination, mistaking it as belief. So the person doesn't believe the delusion. The person imagined that content, but when we believe something, we have beliefs about the belief, and we believe that we believe that. And so these people, they imagine, they make a mistake, and they believe their imagination, and believe that they actually believe what they imagine. But again, he at the end says that we need to have a theory of how believing that we believe something makes us actually believe it. How can, again, believing that we believe our imagination ends up with us believing that? That's one alternative. Another one is actually by Campbell. He uses Wittgenstein's work on uncertainty. It is a very difficult book to read. I don't know how many of you have read it. It's really hard, and I cannot actually put the concept of framework proposition or hinges in this short presentation. But Wittgenstein speaks of the propositions that provide a framework within which the hypotheses are tested. They provide the framework, the background, or the hinges, although there's some people who argue that they're not actually propositions themselves, but these hinges provide that framework. And Campbell believed that the delusions are actually new framework propositions. That's why they are not subject to empirical scrutiny, because hinges, we don't judge them based on truth or falsity. They are the ones that make truth or falsity possible. And again, I said that this framework proposition make other forms of belief or knowledge possible. And for the very same reason, they wanted to satisfy their criteria for beliefs. But the question that comes is that, yes, you said they are framework proposition, right? But how do we know that is there such thing as abnormal framework proposition? Is there anything as pathological framework proposition? And I should think Thornton criticized that idea, so we don't have any external criteria for what is a framework proposition, how to identify them, let alone saying what is a pathological one. They are identified from within a worldview, and we have to go from kind of inside the delusional mind to say. And what they say, this idea, what it says is that why delusions are very hard to understand. Because you can't, rather than saying that they're new hinges, you can say they're a breakdown of hinges. And that's why it's very difficult for us to get into them. And there are some people who defended the belief status, like Professor Lisa Portolotti of Birmingham, that she wrote this book, or that, again, it's a very short summary of it. The book is Autism as Delusions and Other Irrational Beliefs. Very interesting book. If you're interested in the concept of delusion, I recommend it. I said belief status is framed in terms of procedural, epistemic, and agential rationality. And each of them, we say that the procedural is that it fits with other beliefs that the person has. Epistemic is the responsiveness to external evidence. And agential is that it guides behavior in the person. And so that there are other beliefs that do not satisfy their criteria. And delusions are test case. And she believed that they do have belief status. There are the dimensional definitions, and one is by Altman, that said there are several aspects of delusions, and he actually said, let's stop worrying about necessary or sufficient conditions. Delusions are multidimensional. There are many different dimensions. You can measure them on this dimension and decide whether a person is delusional or not. Kepler has these dimensions, and as I said, they're convictions, extension, bizarreness, disorganization, and pressure. And so on this basis, you can say that whether we can say belief is delusional or not. Although how to measure them is quite complex, and where to draw the line, again, is very difficult. I go back to Jasper's here, because again, I found this idea, his ideas interesting. Once he said that the first two sentences are the quote that I mentioned earlier, but he goes on and says that to say that delusions is simply as a mistaken idea is firmly held. It just is superficial. It doesn't answer our problem of delusions, because there are other mistaken ideas. We can't come up with a theory that only says why the person has some stubborn misconceptions. But what makes the delusion the delusion? What makes it so delusional? What makes it different from other forms of person's belief? That's the matter. He sees delusion as a primary phenomenon. And he says that it is kind of a transformation of what he calls the total awareness of reality. And the main focus is the way that we perceive reality here. And he said the delusion is the experience of thinking that something is real. And he actually says that it's then manifests when the experience changes of the person. Then it manifests itself in the judgment. We said the core of the delusion is the experience, but how we see it in the person is in the judgment. And he identifies these three characteristics: that being held with external conviction, impervious to other experience and compelling counter-argument, and content is impossible. But it's not a criteria-based approach. He says, actually he uses the word vaguely. He says delusions are vaguely applied to judgments that they have these criteria. And what he says is that delusions, the way we kind of distinguish them from kind of delusion-like ideas, is that they do not, what he says, they don't emerge understandably from other psychological phenomena. He says them as psychologically ununderstandable and final. Again, this ununderstandability has been subject to a lot of criticism and scrutiny, and I've read a lot about it, and many people didn't actually quote it right. It's, if you want it, you have to go and read his original book. Don't rely on second-hand accounts of it, including mine, I have to say. But yeah, it is true. Go to the source. What it says that we have to put ourselves in the person's shoes and see how can this idea emerge from other psychological phenomena. It's not a theory of what causes the delusions. It's that whether there's any meaningful connections between delusions and other mental states of the person. I gave you the example earlier. There's another one that happened to me. That many years ago I was in a secondment in West Africa, and I used to see patients in open air. And one of them came, and very psychotic, very brain bombarded with cannabis. You might imagine how psychotic they can become. And I was talking to him, sitting outside, and in summer, so lots of flies were around, and then 2 flies fell on the nose in front of us, and they were mating. And he looked and said, "That shows that I'm chosen by God. That's it." So, and I started reasoning with him and said, look, if you look around us, there are many flies, and this is one whether the fly's lifespan is on 10 days, so it's very likely that many flies are mating. So it's not surprising that 2 of them fell on the table. And he didn't have any of it. He believed that that was clear. He just jumped from there that this means that I'm chosen by God. Interestingly, a couple of weeks later, this person got better. Well, cannabis got out of his system, he got some medication. I asked him, do you remember your belief? He said, yes, I don't know why I believe that, but at that moment I was really convinced that I was chosen by God. And it's not me not understanding it, it's the very same person looking back, not understanding how he could think that. And so the emergence of this view, how could someone go meaningfully from that experience to that belief? That is actually an example of the ununderstandability. And he actually says that he predicted that there will be criticism. And he says some people might say that all delusions are understandable, and some say that because the person lacks critical capacity and the poor intelligence. And he acknowledged that the understandable connection plays a part as far as content is concerned, but the essential nature of delusion is unexplained. So we can get some context for emergence of some, as he called, stubborn misconceptions, but what makes this delusion, what turns this misconception into delusion and make it a delusion that stands out, remains hard to grasp. But he again said that delusions do not lie in weakness of intelligence, and he said that a highly critical attitude is rare in healthy people. I don't think it has changed in the last 100 years. Human minds doesn't evolve that quickly. We say a mentally ill patient has as much right to be illogical as a healthy one. And that is something that we actually sometimes forget. And when someone gets a label of mentally ill, they say that they are under constant scrutiny. That's something we all need to be aware that we are also irrational ourselves. And he said that, again, it is a new meaning in delusions, thinking about delusions. He says thinking is thinking about meaning. How he wants to explain is that the experience of delusion is like seeing meaning. Yeah, an example he gives is like seeing a pen. If I see the pen, I see the meaning that this is an instrument for writing. And that is me. But by seeing those two flies, you cannot grasp the same meaning. I don't know whether I can explain it. But so from me seeing something and grasping meaning that this is something to sit on, this is something to write. That meaning, that emergence of meaning in delusion is something that for us, difficult to grasp. But he added that after creation of delusion, the patient takes further step and holds it against all experiences and arguments, and becomes very incorrigible. But he wants to compare it to normal convictions that are formed in context of social living and common knowledge, and said that the delusions is the alteration of personality, something probably organic. Okay, so this is what Jasper said, and in practice, if you talk to delusions, it's a luxury that many practitioners don't have. I had that luxury for last year, I have to say, because I'm the less individual and seeing and talking to them in detail. Then you end up reaching a block that no matter what you go, you end up. And I've said there's some people who said that it's no different from discussion between people who don't share an idea. John Cutting said that the dialogue between non-delusional and delusional is no different no different from the dialogue between an atheist and a religious person. I think there's a difference witnessing both and having done both. There is some difference, and the dialogue, at least the atheist and the religion can have a dialogue. They might disagree on some basic assumptions, but they can reach that. With delusional, it's very difficult to get that. I give another example that it's another gentleman that I saw, and he believed that he was King of England, and he insisted for me to book a limousine to take him to Buckingham Palace. And every time I saw it, I said, "Look, how do you know?" I showed coins. I said, "There's a picture of the Queen, backgrounds, picture of the Queen. You see on television, is a Queen. You have a Queen." And he said, "No, I know it." It wasn't even disagreement on some presupposition. he categorically actually brushed me aside and said, I know it, and that's it. You are wrong. And became actually angry with me. So I stopped challenging him. But that's it. And I think when practicing incorrigibility of the delusional person is very different from incorrigibility of other strongly held beliefs. So that's a totally different topic. There's one interesting idea by Sean Gallagher, who he has somewhat called the externalistic approach, and he tries to understand subject as brain, body, environment system, and the person is in the world an embodied pragmatic agent. And there is a paramount reality shared by everyone, and well, people also live in other realities. He gives an example that when we talk about works of fiction, for instance, how many of you like Game of Thrones? Yeah? Oh, yeah, good, me too. But when you talk about it, you have a different world, that they have dragons. You know, you can say, oh, that doesn't happen. Or dragons don't do this. But yeah, and then we come back to the real world and we forget about dragons. And he believes delusions of such thing is one alternative reality. And that's what the person actually shifts between the alternative and the consensually valid reality. Then going back to my gentleman, he was telling me that you have to get me a limousine to go to Buckingham Palace. On my way, I want to stop at welfare and get my benefits. So I said, how would you need benefit if you're the king? You have 150 million pounds of it, but it's not in welfare. But he said, no, I want to stop at welfare, get my benefits, and then we go to Buckingham Palace. And it's very interesting that how he switched between the realities. So, let me see. Yeah. Again, this is some delusions into profound alteration laws of physics and spatial orientation. That's, again, patient that I saw. We believe that razors generated in kind of the lamps coming out, getting into his brain, cut it. But in everyday life, he observed the rules of physics. He didn't think that he could pass through the wall. Just use the door. And this idea actually addresses a double bookkeeping problem. Okay, the debate is far from over. We have new conceptual frameworks. And the question is actually why bother? We have been working without definition for decades. And you might think that after listening to me, that all these different definitions, all these different problems, do we psychiatrists know what we're talking about? How do we practice? Has it come to you? Has this question occurred to you? That, how do you do this? And actually that's interesting because I thought about it and the thing is delusions are a very vague concept, but because they're vague doesn't mean they are invalid. That's very difficult. And people know, generally lay people identify people who are delusional. And I remember again when I was working, especially when you go to another culture and you don't know their ideas, you might find their ideas quite bizarre, but they, among themselves, could identify a person who was delusional, and to me, the outsider, both ideas seemed equally bizarre. But for them, they could easily see that. So, one of the important things is that do we agree as psychiatrists what something is delusion or not? And that's what's called some interpreter reliability, and they measured by something called a kappa score. Don't know whether you know about it. It's the statistical test that measures the kind of reliability and agreement beyond chance. When you have kappa score of 1 means that 100% agreement, 0 means every agreement that you have is by chance, and -1 means that is total disagreement. So I searched and I found some studies about comparing how we see delusions with the rest of medicine. Okay. You see, that is the kappa scores. In the specialist assessing delusions is 0.86. 0.81 to 1 is seen as very good. Assessing the height of patient's JBP. You know what JBP is? It's actually the jugular vein. It goes high when you have heart failure. So that's one of the indices to see. It's very low. They classify diabetic retinopathy from retinal photographs and 55. Interpreted mammogram X-ray, better, still not good. So interestingly, we diagnose delusions more reliably than our colleagues in other areas of medicine. But still, yeah, it's very difficult to define it. And I've said that 14% that we don't agree, those are the difficult parts. Because people can usually see something that is very delusional, but some difficult cases, those are the ones that people disagree. And again, you end up in some more pragmatic aspect of how it has affected the patient's life, the risk and stuff, and decide what to do. And again, you need to go to lots of consultations, many different people. It's not an easy thing. Well, thank you very much. I hope that I haven't bored you to death. But, thanks.
Thank you, Abdi. And Luis Flores, also a psychiatrist, also a PhD candidate, but in our philosophy department at King's. Luis Flores.
Hello. Well, above all, thanks to Abdi for this talk. Very interesting overview about the controversies and the difficulties surrounding the definition of delusions. It's difficult to decide what to comment on about the talk, because Abdi raises many different points. I just want to pick up on two things. First, from the clinical point of view, as a psychiatrist, I agree that it is very, very difficult to define delusions. As a medic, we take delusions mainly as symptoms. Symptoms that in some cases are just one of many symptoms defining or characterizing a disease such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and in other cases are the most important symptom that it is the organizing principle giving the main characteristics of the disorder as in delusional disorder. And as symptoms, we really, as a clinician, we don't really take them too seriously as conceptual objects. We just use them as things to pick up something else, to know about the prognosis of the patient, to know about what to do with the patient. But it is very, very difficult when you stop and try to think about in a set of necessary and sufficient conditions to really come up with relevant distinctions, to distinguish, for example, normal beliefs from what we call irrational beliefs. And as Abdi pointed out, whether delusions are really beliefs at all. That obviously depends on the definition of beliefs. And the part of false beliefs depends on how we take rationality. So from the clinical point of view, we use delusions to pick up some conditions, to isolate some patients, but the main point is that there is no clear way to define a priori what is a delusional patient or what is a delusion. That is why you cannot go to a computer and test yourself right now and see whether you are delusional or not. There is an important room for judgment, and that is why you need a clinical assessment, and there is some things like the opinion of your family and other clinicians, and there is some sort of agreement. But obviously this agreement is in many cases faulty and limited, and that is why we may come up with many errors, as the first case that present Abdi. The other point I wanted to mention is how philosophy might help us on this. We clinicians, as I said, we focus on utility of symptoms in the practical side, but we are not sophisticated conceptually speaking. We're a bit lazy on that. And that is why philosophers might help, because we can assess how consistent are the kind of conceptual distinctions we're making, and we can test them. We can try to assess whether our ideas about delusions need revision. Abdi mentioned German Berrius. He's a very important psychopathologist. He's almost 80 years old now, but I am really impressed about the debate about delusions. This debate hasn't reached clinical psychiatry yet, and it would be very important to generate more dialogue between philosophers and psychiatrists, because there are many things to do. For example, for starters, I would say, we might start questioning the idea of delusions as one class, one thing, delusions at all. We might want to destroy the concept and try to make distinctions and speak about different things, because it is obviously an heterogeneous class, even as a symptom. We're not just talking about a syndrome. We're not talking about the symptoms that where delusions are part. We are thinking now in delusions and saying, well, perhaps this is not a unique thing. Perhaps we might raise new distinctions and propose new concepts. But of course, these concepts shouldn't be tested just in a theoretical area. They should be empirically tested for their clinical utility and all those practical things that doctors need. So thanks again to Abdi, and now we open the discussion for questions.
Do you want to say a few words before the questions, or?
Yeah, it's just interesting that you mentioned the relationship between philosophy and psychiatry and medicine in general. Because I was at this talk and the speaker believed that medicine is applied science. But sometimes we focus most on application of certain branches of science, and we lose the bigger picture and important questions. And so one can be a very good doctor, a very good psychiatrist without any knowledge of these basics, because they apply these certain ideas very well. So into one of the cases that I was talking about recently, we had a famous neurosurgeon in the USA who was claiming that the pyramids were for storing grains. He hasn't been to pyramids. If you go, there's no space in them. So, and I said that is critical thinking sometimes we doctors miss. And philosophy is something that will help us a lot in that. And I think the whole purpose of seminars like this is to bring the two disciplines together, which can be very helpful.
Okay, great. Thanks to both of you. We now have lots of time for questions, and I'll give the microphone to whoever's going to.
Thank you. I don't know the literature on defining delusions, so this might have already been covered. But it seems to me that a distinction between a delusion and a belief is that beliefs are volitional. You decide to believe something, you weigh up the evidence on either side, whereas with a delusion, there's no such active volition, they're kind of involuntary beliefs. Is that something that's been covered and rejected, or is that?
Actually, are beliefs volitional? You decide to believe something.
I would say that you do.
Well, if I see this chair is brown, I don't decide to believe this chair is brown. That's my perception actually starts this belief in me.
But you perceive it and then you make the statement, whereas with delusions it seems to work the other way around. The reasoning is post hoc.
So you can, because I said that it's kind of emergence of meaning, and in the same way that the belief that is form is emergence of something from my perception, some people believe that delusions are in the same way with emergence of a meaning. Capgras delusions, it is shown that they don't have the affective response when they see a familiar face. And based on that perception, this belief develops. And many people also, after actually the delusions come into being, they go and they take that further steps and they try to rationalize their delusion in different ways. And The man that I mentioned, when I said, why isn't your picture on the coin? He said, because I gave permission myself. So they have an active role too in maintaining the delusion.
Yeah, I see that bit.
But I have to say that when I was reading about the kind of criteria of the belief, volition wasn't on top of this. I said the main forms of rationality, the agential, procedural, and epistemic ones were the main ones. But again, it's because we have many different beliefs in our mind, but have we volitionally generated all of these? Not sure. So I don't have a direct answer to that, but I haven't read volition being a kind of necessary condition of belief.
Someone else, you can pass it on down. Okay, please go.
When you look at the amount of disagreement that clinicians have based on like diabetic retinopathy, when you compare it to the definition or the diagnosis of delusion in patients, would you say that maybe defining delusion is more intuitive because the others would be comparing lots and lots of empirical scientific evidence to sort of define an illness, and maybe the like nitty-gritty of it breeds the disagreement? Or
Actually, I think that in those cases, having criteria, it's easier to have criteria. Because there are things that you can also measure. But in delusions, there's no measurement in a way. But in majority of cases, delusions are very clear. When reading about it, I couldn't help but think of when St. Augustine, then he wrote that I know what time is, but when you ask me to define it, I cannot. And it's kind of like that, it's very vague. We know it when we see it, but if someone asks, okay, define, why is it? But again, there are some cases, as the first case I mentioned, it's very difficult to decide if someone is delusional or not. Now, I put that slide to show that yes, the agreement is quite high whether someone is delusional, despite lack of definition. Goes back to what Luis said, that the utility of the concept is high, although it's still quite vague.
I was just wondering, in the introduction to this talk, it says the beliefs of deluded people can be true, and I was just wondering if you have you any experience of an example of that, like a person who's deluded, but yet.
I haven't had the experience myself, and it's in literature that people say, the example of the person, this delusion of infidelity is the main one. Because on many occasions the person annoys the partner so much that the partner ends up being unfaithful. It has happened. So that's true. But there are cases that we say that the delusional based on falsity and it turned out to be true. Or there's this case, we're talking about that there's this concept of epistemic injustice, we apply it to delusions, and some people who are delusional, they're labeled as irrational. And whatever they say is seen as delusional. There was this case that was discussed in one of the different fora, and although it wasn't published, I forgot the psychiatrist, and similar cases that I had, that a clear example was this man who was admitted because he wanted to kill someone and said, this person has abused my niece. And the guy was psychotic, he had many different delusions, but they saw that belief as delusion to turned out to be true. And it wasn't a delusion, it was a very valid belief, it was true. And his reaction to that was also quite understandable, that a loved one was abused and he wanted to go and kill that person.
Do you believe that it's possible that people who are called delusional in fact turn out to be the people who have the true beliefs or have the right beliefs, but it's, I don't know, the rest of people involved?
They are way ahead of us and see things that we don't see.
Yeah,
Is that?
something like that. So
Well,
that
actually, I once met an anthropologist who believed that delusions are necessary for human progress, and believed some of the visionaries that started big movements, they might have been delusional, and other people followed them and it became a big movement. I I'd rather not opine on that, but yeah, there are some people who believe that delusions are necessary. We need to have that.
Lewis wants to follow up.
Perhaps one of the most difficult cases to distinguish is when, for example, in manic depressive psychosis, when you have a patient that his beliefs or her beliefs are grounded in real things. For example, this is funny, but I am ugly and I don't have a job and I am poor, whatever, and suppose that these things are true, but the intensity with which he held these things is so great that he is psychopathic and he is one to act many things. In this case, it's very difficult to draw a line whether this guy is really thinking or believing something that is true, or he's exaggerating something, because the idea, the content of the delusion is not bizarre. It is well grounded in reality. And with respect to another question, of course, there are historical examples in which you have a genius which thinks that the earth is round, and the other people think that no, it's plain. But these, of course, are historical things that we cannot take for granted.
It's a very good example, because there's actually Bill Fulford wrote about delusional values, the value judgments that we have in depressive people, you see. I had cases that said, I haven't paid my bill, I have to be put down and killed. But I don't see anywhere in the world you say that this is a kind of punishment you can imagine for someone who hasn't paid a kind of £5 bill. Or there was another case in the literature, the person didn't give pocket money, forgot to give pocket money to his son, and believed that I deserve to die because of that. That kind of extreme value judgments. And it's interesting, I mentioned framework propositions, they can help in these ones. There's this commentary on Wittgenstein by Abraham Stroud, and he said that we can distinguish errors from things that are much more deep. If I, in a kind of an auditorium, there are 250 chairs and I still can't, and you say 249, so you can make an error in that. But if you come and say there are 5, it's not an error when there are 250 of them around. Either you don't understand the concept of counting, we didn't understand me, we don't know the meaning of the numbers. That's much deeper. And in certain cases, it's like that. It's so off the mark that you can say that it's not, you cannot make error like this. You cannot make an error of judgment like this. You say that because I didn't pay pocket money to my son, I deserve to be put down and executed. I don't think anyone in right frame of mind said that it is kind of reasonable to think that. Yeah.
There was someone here. Yeah. Can you use the microphone so we get it on recording?
So you said at the start that part of the criteria was that they weren't influenced by their culture or subculture. In the case of people with who like conspiracy theorists, where there's a lot of people that like, have that same belief, is that, and if it affects their lives, is that thought mostly as mental illness or just like poor reasoning?
Well, again, conspiracy theory, I can understand the mind of a conspiracy theorist, although I have to say I'm from a conspiracy theorist background, and I grew up in a society that they already saw hand of someone in something. And we do have this bias of seeing patterns when patterns are not there. So we can, I can use my experience of my irrational thinking to understand that conspiracy theorist. And again, sometimes this becomes so well, can even a conspiracy theorist think like that? So I know I've met people that, I have an American friend who believes that 9/11 was George Bush's plot. And I think that, how could you say that? Making a mistake. I give this to all my medical students, and they also have this delusion. I said it's not, actually, it is Scientology. Well, they hate us, although I have to say, you shouldn't mess with them. I love Tom Cruise. Watch Mission Impossible. But but it is a legitimate belief of a religion. And I think that they have every right to be called a religion status like any other ones. So,
But what would you do if you had a patient who came in and said that? You would not.
well, if that patient belongs to that group, I don't see that as delusion. And again,
Just think of your group on your side. You're not delusional.
but the thing is, I have to say, we are in one sense lucky, and is that people don't come with isolated delusions. They rarely do. They come with a complex group of symptoms, and it has really affected their lives in a very negative way. If I tell you that half of people who are homeless in London, they have a psychotic illness. You might be surprised, but there was one statistic that showed that. So it really is detrimental to their lives. Not just the delusion, the other aspects of the problems that they have.
Just in part, the good interrater reliability in the case of the diagnosis of delusions is due to selection bias. You have to understand that these are patients that are brought to be assessed, but there are many patients that are quasi-delusional, semi-delusion around, and we don't have assessment of them. And that is much more complex. That is where these distinctions, the problems, the boundaries, the borderline cases become difficult. So in the case of conspiracy theorists, they don't go to psychiatrists. We don't even have to assess them.
But there's something interesting. Conspiracy theorists agree with each other. There's this book I recommend if you have time, it's called Three Christs of Ypsilanti. There's one psychologist that brought three people who believed they were Christ and see how they interacted. Could any of them convince the other one that it's not Christ? Well, it didn't happen. They all continue to remain, they believe that they are Christ and the other ones were false. And there is research that showed that while patients don't see this in themselves, they can see it in other people. That's good. And there's something I hear a lot at work that you brought me to this place in not house, in all these not cases around me. There's nothing wrong with it, they're all mad. And yeah, and if you look at it, they don't see it themselves, but they're very good in identifying it in others. But the conspiracy theorists, they see the exchange ideas and they agree on it. But even the
And I mean, does the number play a role in the assessment
well,
or
actually,
something?
that is one of the difficulties in defining, because again, it was, so if the numbers define, if a lot of people believe in something, is it delusional? And I would say that even when you see the delusions, the contents is very person specific. The spiritual delusions are very solipsistic. And if people believe, you can imagine everybody believe they're king. Can that happen? You imagine everybody believe that they're the king. So I don't think that it makes it less delusional, because you cannot have 1 million kings in a country. And then you have to go and assess them individually to see why they arrived at that thing. And that, again, that's why you cannot judge it only on basis of content. You have to go and see how they arrived at that judgment. And that will help. Again, isolation is not the only way to diagnose someone as delusional. So that your question is very valid. That's one of the weak points.
Yeah, and the other thank you. And the other question was a really practical approach to this is, I mean, I'm a philosopher, so I'm not usually for the practical approach, but for example, last year I was at a conference, and it was a bioethics conference, and a GP asked me, I had a patient that thought that it was a deer, like a deer the animal, and how do I treat this person, and without just imposing my beliefs on his, because he really believed that. And I don't know, but my idea was like, let's suppose that this person believed it was a deer, and he was not treating himself for other conditions because he thought that his whole problem was being a deer. And I thought, like, okay, let's put aside the delusional part of this belief and let's treat other conditions. So what I mean is, if somebody has a delusional behavior, but on top of that is like, for example, risking to hurt himself or herself, then why not like set aside the delusional part and just tackle the other problems?
It's a very valid point, because there are two things. One is that the decision of whether someone is delusional. The second one is the decision of whether to treat that person. Because treatment sometimes means coercion. That man who believes that he's dear, how can you treat? He doesn't agree with you. He doesn't think that I need any treatment. I said, I'm a dear, why are you going to do that? The treatment that he wants is probably to be taken to Richmond Park, and that's where dears are. So you need to coerce. But you can say, in order to do that, then you have to have further discussions. How is this belief affecting this patient's life? How is this kind of way of life? If this person goes to work, brings money, feeds his kids, provides shelter for them, does everything that we do, why? Why to interfere? That's it, you don't have any judgment to actually force treatment on the person. I give you an example of this lady who believed that she was Virgin Mary. As she was working in a charity shop, she came to see me, very lovely person. I said, no, but I am Virgin Mary. I gave birth to Christ 2,000 years ago. And she said that she was accepting her medication and working and earning money. But would I like to actually again lock her up and force more medication on her? No. And she was delusional, but there was no justification for coercion. It's for treating people, because it's a practical matter, you need practical reasons, not just philosophical ones.
Thank you for the conference. I just want to comment that maybe, well, of course, philosophy and also Jacques Lacan has a support, I think, a lot for psychiatry, because he works with the language and also with the social part of a delusion. And he wrote once that who is more deluded, the homeless who believe is a king or the king? Because the king at the end is an ego construction. That's why for me that phrase makes a lot of sense, and I'm working through it because it's not an easy phrase. But I think it's really important, the language contribution, the social contribution, the difference between what's the subject and what's the ego and how it works. And also he in his PhD thesis works with this woman who has a paranoia with a singer or an actress, and she attempted to kill her. And his thesis mainly worked with this social contribution to the psychotic problem. And as Luis says, I think it's really important to have really clear the concept and work really serious. It's not just go to the DS4 or 5. Just I say like really work deeply and serious with the concept. What is a belief? The different concepts of belief, or that's
Actually, last point of view, I agree. That's what I intend to do. That's what we try to do, to promote the philosophy in psychiatry. I have to say, I am totally unfamiliar with Lacan and his work. It's difficult to read. I don't have the time to sit and read him in detail. And his version of psychoanalysis is very complex. I know. I have to say something about psychoanalytic views and delusions. I haven't read that much, but for the first half of 20th century, psychoanalysis was the dominant force in psychiatry. Actually, to be a psychiatrist, you had to be an analyst. And even until recently in USA, you had to be a psychoanalyst to be a psychiatrist. Yet, I don't think they managed to make a big difference in lives of the delusional. delusional people. And that's why it's the other kind of schools actually replaced them, whether biological or cognitive or scientific, they came and replaced psychoanalysis, and in a way they're no longer dominant. But for Lacan, I have to say, I'm totally ignorant, I'm really sorry about that. But I totally agree with your last point that we really have to go to the core of the concept and not just focus on the utility of it.
I just wanted to return to Julia's first point about the number of people. And building on what you said, is it then an issue of consensus? So if you took the man who thought that he was God because flies mated in front of him, I can see what you're saying, that if he came back with 5 people who believed the same thing,
Same thing meaning that he's God.
no, that they were each God because they'd seen a fly mated in front of them, that would be delusional because they're conflicted. But if he came back with those 5 people who each said, we saw a fly mate in front of him, so he must be God, would that still be defined as a delusion?
No, the two things. If the other people believe that he was chosen,
Because they'd seen a fly.
because look, how they acquire it matters, because there was this, he would be delusional, they might actually be influenced by him and acquire that belief.
So the leader's delusion. So would the leader of Scientology be delusional?
No, actually, I don't think he was. If you read his story, he came up with the ideas in different ways. He was a very smart person, in fact. He was a very good businessman, and he had the vision and knew that to have an American religion, you need to have 2 things. One is money, and second is Hollywood. It is a very kind of, you need to be a visionary to get that at that time. And that's how he succeeded. And it's a very growing religion. Yeah.
There's someone right next to me.
Maybe hand it back to the lady.
Waiting beside him.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask, have you ever experienced or heard of 2 people having the same, I mean, it's kind of following off that, 2 people having the same delusion about the same person, as in, so 2 people both thinking their, 2 siblings thinking their dad is an imposter or whatever?
Actually, not in that. Fully other happens is that in a relationship that one person is very dominant, the other one is submissive, and they're very much isolated. The person who is submissive ends up acquiring the belief of the dominant person who is delusional. But when you separate them, the submissive one usually loses that delusion. But the first one, the dominant one, doesn't.
So you've never experienced 2 people having a delusion that's completely irrational to everyone else, that each of them is separately rational, and not because one's just copied the other, like they both seem to have
I haven't seen that 2 people having the same delusion. As I say, it's very solipsistic. Each concerns the same person. It's inward looking rather than outward looking. The significance for the person. Other people might actually believe in the delusion and say he is right because we believe him or he's charismatic for many other reasons. But they won't be delusional. They will be misguided.
So that's kind of the key aspect of the delusion.
Well, it is, but it's not something that you can measure. You can get it in kind of by looking at the belief itself. But you must remember, delusions are things that people say, and you have to put in, it's the person who has that. They're not, so they're different from an infection that I get. They're part of the person. So you cannot separate them from the person. It's a person who harbors a delusion. You have to judge it in that person. So there's this lady that whose hand has been up for last.
Thank you. My question is, when do you define something as a delusion, considering that I suppose we all harbor small delusions, but perhaps they're not harmful. Is delusion in your field something only applied to delusions that become harmful for the patient? And would you treat someone whose delusion seems completely benign and not to be hurting anybody else?
To treat the people, it's not just harming other people, it's just for the person too. If someone is no risk to himself or others, and there's simple delusion, it's just one delusion, you don't force treat that. Why would you do that? So that's the decision I'm treating. But some people have persecutory ideas, they isolate themselves, they don't go out. I remember this particular man who developed this persecutory delusions very badly and stopped going to work and used his saving, and when his saving ran out, he gave up his flat and went and lived homeless for 5 years. And once he was attacked and ended up in hospital, and then they realized that what this guy is talking is very paranoid. And realized that yeah, for years he was ill, but he wasn't picked up. But if delusion is causing this harmful effect on the person, yes, of course you will treat. Again, there are many other factors. This is the treatments, it's always better to be cooperative than coercive. Always.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question.
Can you take the mic? Yeah, great.
People have lots of beliefs that are not true. For example, we probably have been selected for having a bit of inflated view of ourselves, of our capabilities and our attractiveness, and etc. So, do we really need a concept of delusions? Would you not say that you just treat beliefs or perceptions or convictions that are harmful, especially if you just follow the utility concept? And is it just not a matter of trial and error, like which kind of potentially harmful states respond to medication or CBT? Do we really need it?
I think it's more than trial and error. I give you 3 cases. Okay. They're all 3 cases of a man who kills his wife. The first person actually finds evidence that his wife is kind of unfaithful and kills him. Second one is misguided. Fully misguided, he developed these beliefs that is totally untrue. The third one is delusional and based on one of these delusional perceptions. There's a difference, and the first 2 will go to criminal justice, third one comes to us. And I think it's not just on the basis of just being irrational. My point is delusion is more than just being irrational. It all can be irrational. And that's the essence that we try to capture, that what is it that makes them beyond irrationality? They're more than errors. I think it's not just we doing in trial and error, try to see who responds, who doesn't. That there is more to this. So that's my personal opinion.
What is the difference between those 2 cases? Where the misguided one?
Well, that's the misguided one. You cannot go and treat. They're misguided. He forms a belief based on people misguiding him and believing them.
Oh, so he had evidence, but it was misleading.
Like Othello. He was misguided and he ends up killing Desdemona. But Othello might have developed the idea of Desdemona being unfaithful by just seeing 2 flies again.
Maybe nearby over there's someone.
I have a lady over there.
Yeah, I was wondering how useful you think the concept of integrated reliability is at all in psychiatry, because I think you could make the argument that in psychiatry diagnosing is not diagnosing in the strict sense of the word, it's more, you're not diagnosing some sort of underlying disease entity, you're classifying types of behaviour and experiences and beliefs maybe. So maybe you could say that the fact that lots of psychiatrists agree on who is delusional and who's not does not mean that you've correctly identified some sort of disease entity, it just means that you're all using the same criteria, which they are.
Well, it's a question of reliability and validity, so whether it's a valid concept, the delusions. But you cannot have the validity without all agreeing on something. And the reason that these things improved, there was a time that they did this study, and in some parts of USA they diagnosed schizophrenia 100 times than in UK. I said that, do we really know what we're talking about? And then the question was really put to psychiatrists was 50, 60 years ago. That you guys really don't understand. How come? Does it mean that Americans are 100 times madder than British? But they realized that that's where these came. But what the delusions are a valid concept. I'm saying I have practiced this, practiced psychiatry in different cultures and different continents. And in different languages, they all have a word for it. They all have a word for madness, they all have a word for delusional, and going back, I tried to read literature going back to 1,000 years ago, where it was long before the Enlightenment and proper psychiatry even. That Avicenna, who was a Persian physician, he was talking about delusions, and said it's madness is when reality is replaced by fantasy. And he could identify, and again, the case is interesting, similar to the deer case that mentioned that this son of a king who believed that he was a cow, and so you have to kill him. And probably had some malnutrition, and he dressed as a butcher in one of the first CBT attempts, and we said this cow is very skinny, feed him more. And they fed him and he recovered. Maybe it was self-limiting or maybe a nutritional problem. But so that this concept existed long before and goes across the cultures. Society is very important, but one thing I personally don't subscribe to is the cultural relativism and believing everything is just socially constructed. Because society is us, human beings, is a collection of us. It's not something there that we just fall into and determines us. We are the ones who form it. And yes, language is something that evolved along with our societies, but that doesn't mean that language is something that is very relative. It happens if you see different languages, by and large, have similar structures. It's not my specialty, but I think that going back, knowing that this has happened in different parts of the world, and different parts that they kind of didn't know of each other, and there is some validity to the concept. As much as you can have with concepts like this, that they're not organic. And I hope that neuroscience would at some point help us to identify what is the different pattern. That is the way the neuroscientific basis of perception of reality and how it changes. So maybe they will, maybe they won't.
Going back to Lacan, one of Lacan's other famous statements, I know you said you weren't too familiar, but I want to ask based on this, one of his other famous statements is that reality has the structure of a fiction. And if you take away the fiction, you also lose the reality. And based on that, I'm curious, do you think there is such a thing as a non-delusional subject?
Well, no, I do think I can say how it follows, because when I say fiction, the way I read it kind of more metaphorically, that yes, we're kind of storytelling beings, and we develop a narrative in our lives. But how does delusion fit in that narrative? That matters. And again, in many people, delusion is the break in the narrative of the person's life. That's what makes it very hard to understand. How can this idea fit in the life story? But again, there are people who, after living 40 years with that delusion, it becomes part of their life.
Yeah.
But and that's when the decision comes whether to treat or not. Someone who has lived with something for 40 years without any kind of instance, any harm, I think, why would you do that? And yes, it would be hard to diagnose. I hate to say the word diagnosing delusion, to deem someone delusional after all these years. It becomes then. But where to draw the line is difficult. As it goes to the vagueness of the concept. It is very vague.
Next door, the lady right here.
Me?
Yeah.
Sorry. I might have misunderstood, but what I've gathered from this conversation and your talk is that the difference between a delusional person and a normal person is that like a delusion is illogical and a different idea to what everyone else thinks is grounded in kind of logic and come about like by a logical explanation, right?
Logical.
So, for
I
example,
never mentioned logic even once.
well, sorry, basically like how a religious person, okay, believes in God, it might not be true, but they have valid reasons for believing in God.
Actually, it's very interesting the demarcation between delusion and religious ideas, or fanatically held ones. No, it's not logic, and that's why I said delusion is different from error. It's not that the person is irrational, it's deeper than that. It's more than just irrational to being illogical. Again, there's a quote by Jasper said delusion to knowledge and error has the same relationship with knowledge and error as it has with faith and superstition. You have people who have beliefs, and I said I can communicate with them. You can see different religions communicate with each other, although they might disagree with each other. But they understand that at certain basic assumptions they disagree. And they agree to disagree in a way. With delusional, it's very difficult to agree to disagree even.
But they still disagree.
Well, they do disagree, but they can understand the assumption that they have, that they disagree. I'll give you an example. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I was in Egypt. We went to one of the oldest mosques in Egypt. And it is the oldest mosque, almost 1400 years old. And the Imam approached my friend and said, "Do you believe in God?" And he said, "No." And then they started having a conversation. And at the end, they agreed that they don't agree on certain assumptions that the Imam had, that order cannot come from disorder. And my friend rejected it. And so I don't agree with that assumption. But they could see where the difference lies. And again, you could see both are rational. And you can have people who are superstitious. You know, even very religious people call them, well, this is more superstition, it's not religion. It's very difficult to demarcate the two. But a person who has religious delusions, again, first is very person-centered. They believe they are God, they believe they are very significant. You know, where I grew up in, and going to a hospital in south of Tehran, which is a religious area, there are many people who believe they are the 12th Imam. They are chosen and they're going to bring peace to the world. And the way that they got to that idea was very interesting. How does someone acquire religious belief? Either you grow up with it, you're taught it and you're in the society that it grows up, or if you join, you have some sort of experience. But the experience is transcendental. You see more significant in the world, not significant in you. The world acquires a meaning that there's more to life than this. But in delusion doesn't come and say there's more to life than this. It has a meaning. So it has for me. I'm the one. I'm the chosen one. Or I'm Christ. Contrary to some, I believe there is a difference between the two.
So using that logic, would you consider patients that are like transgender patients or BIID as delusional?
No, because it is not, again, the transgender person is a kind of gender identity. It's not a belief, it's some idea that you have of your gender, that you grow up with, and you say, am I a man or a woman? Some of them, they have this thing that they're in the feeling that they're in the wrong body. I give you an example that I saw at some point they used to see them a lot to actually see if there's any psychiatric illness so they can be operated on. And one of them said that when he wore his wife's dress, looked at the mirror, and at that moment everything fell in place. All his anxiety disappeared. And it was a liberating experience for him. And he could discuss it, he could explain it to me very clearly. And it was more something in emotions rather than in cognition, let's put it this way. Or people who have, again, body dysmorphia. Some people develop kind of hypochondriacal delusions, no mistake. There's some people who come and they have some very bizarre ideas about themselves. But by and large, it's more in terms of emotions and anxiety and sort of discomfort that they have. Now there's this group, there's this people who believe, oh, their limbs is extra, and they go at length to cut it off. But no, it is a feeling they have about themselves, and it's an idea of the self. All the delusions involve the self too.
It's the person that believes he's Christ.
There is difference. This person feels that this thing is extra on me. I mean, if I want to call this man sick, I can say the people, if you go again to my hometown, is the capital of nose jobs. Am I going to, by extension, say these people who believe their noses are big, they are deluded? It's just dissatisfaction with some form part of the anatomy. But if it ends up in a this kind of construction of your reality that, yes, I am Christ, or my nose is massive, and then you develop kind of value judgment that based on it, I want to cut it with a knife or something, then that's it. It's, again, something that is more than an error or just a bad judgment. It becomes a different quality at the end. But you can put it in words and make you put a necessary criteria for it is something that is very difficult to do. So that's what makes our job very difficult. Otherwise, everybody could do it.
Well, with that, I think, I know there are more questions, I wish we could go on, but we've come to time. It's a great question to end on. Can you move to the next slide just for a moment? Our next event is the annual Peter Sowerby Lecture in Philosophy and Medicine. If I had to live like you, I think I'd kill myself. Apparently people who are actually disabled rate their happiness higher than people who aren't disabled try to imagine what it would be like to be disabled. So this is something to try to explain. That's on the 26th of November, and everyone is welcome and it's free, but you need to book because there's a reception afterwards. I need head count. At the current time, it's fully booked. However, I expect that there will be cancellations. I'm going to send out an email saying if you aren't coming, please let us know. So if you check out the website, it may become possible the week before the event to book it out. So this last thing is to thank our speakers and